For 7 nights in a row, the horse stood over the same patch of earth in the dark. She never moved. She never made a sound. And Rowan Collister, who had raised that animal from a foal and understood her better than he understood most people, had no explanation for what she was doing out there. He watched her from the bedroom window. He could not go to her. He could not go anywhere. His foot was broken in 2 places, wrapped in a temporary cast that the doctor in town had fitted 5 days ago, with instructions to stay off it entirely for at least 3 weeks. Rowan had nodded and said the word yes in the right places, and he had meant it, more or less. He had not meant it the way the doctor meant it. He had meant it the way a man who has lived alone on 70 acres for the last 11 years means anything when someone else tries to tell him what he can and cannot do on his own land. But his foot was broken, and the crutches were leaning against the wall on the wrong side of the bed, and out across the yard, past the fence and the old walnut tree and the low stone wall that separated the main property from the back field, his horse was standing motionless over his daughter's grave at 2 a.m. This was not normal behavior for Cinder. This was not normal behavior for any horse. What Rowan did not know yet, as he stood at that window with one hand pressed against the glass and the cold coming through it into his palm, was that Cinder had not eaten since the day before. The water bucket in her stall was still full. The hay was untouched. And what Rowan would not discover for another 4 days, when the truth finally came out of that ground in a way that changed how he understood everything, was that his daughter had been trying to tell him something for the last 2 years of her life. She just hadn't been able to find the words. Not while she was living, anyway. The broken foot had started the way most of the hardest things in Rowan Collister's life had started, which was with him deciding alone, without consulting anyone, that a job needed doing and that he was the one to do it. There had been people over the years who had offered to help him with the property. Patrice offered regularly. A younger man named Cord, who lived in town, had come out a few times to help with fencing and had done good work and had a way of working quietly beside a person without needing to fill the silence, which Rowan appreciated. His late wife's brother had come twice in the early years. Before the relationship had gone the direction those relationships go when one person dies and the survivors have no strong reason to keep their connection alive. Rowan did not use any of them as often as they were offered, and he used Cord not at all anymore, because Cord had moved to a different county, and he was not the kind of man who easily asked for what he needed, which was a characteristic that had served him in some ways and cost him in others. The broken foot had started with a ladder and a section of roof gutter that had pulled away from the fascia board on the east side of the house. Rowan had noticed it 3 weeks ago. He had not done anything about it for 2 of those weeks, which was his way. He did not rush anything he could defer, and he deferred a great many things. The property had the slightly tended-over quality of a place where one person was doing the work of 3, where things got fixed eventually, but not always on schedule, where the paint on the south-facing barn wall had been peeling since before his daughter was born, and would probably continue peeling for some time after he was gone. He had climbed the ladder on a Tuesday morning in mid-October, the kind of cold, clear morning where the air had that particular quality of being used up, like the year was running out of oxygen. He had reached the section of gutter that had pulled away. He had been in the process of reattaching it when the ladder shifted. It did not fall completely. It slid sideways along the wall in a slow, deliberate way that gave him exactly enough time to understand what was happening before the understanding became irrelevant. He came down wrong. His right foot took all of it. He lay in the dead leaves beside the house for a while, not because he could not move, but because moving required a kind of commitment he was not ready to make yet. The sky above him was that deep October blue that happens only a few weeks a year. A hawk was circling in the upper field. He could hear Cinder moving in the far paddock, her hooves on the cold ground, that particular rhythm that horses have when they are not going anywhere specific, but cannot be still. He got himself up eventually, and into the house, and to the phone. He sat on the kitchen floor for a moment before attempting the chair, because the kitchen floor was lower, and the distance between the floor and the chair was something he wanted to manage carefully. He dialed Patrice's number from memory because he had long ago decided not to rely on the phone to remember things for him. While he waited for her, he sat with his back against the cabinets and his right foot extended in front of him at the angle that hurt the least, which was not quite straight and not quite angled. And he looked at the kitchen ceiling, which needed repainting and had needed repainting for 2 years, and which would, at this rate, need repainting for at least 2 more. He thought about the gutter. He thought about whether the section he had reattached before falling had actually been properly secured, or whether it was going to come down again in the first hard rain. He thought about whether the section he had not yet reached was going to hold through winter, or whether he would be dealing with ice dams in January. He did not think about the fall itself, or about what the pain in his foot meant, or about whether being a man who lived alone on 70 acres with a broken foot was a situation that warranted a certain level of concern. He had a very practiced ability to not think about those things until he absolutely had to, which was another characteristic that had costs he was aware of and costs he was not. His neighbor Patrice came first, which was how it always was. Patrice Almeida lived on the farm that bordered his to the north, and she had been the first person to call after Nessa died, and the first person to show up and the last person to leave. And she was the kind of neighbor that people in cities had given up believing existed anymore. She drove him to the urgent care clinic in her truck, 40 minutes each way, and waited the whole time, and drove him back with his foot in a temporary cast and a set of crutches in the truck bed. She stayed for dinner that night and the night after, and she would have stayed longer, but Rowan told her he was fine, which was what he always told people, and she knew him well enough by now to understand that the statement was not an invitation to argue. He had been alone on the property since Nessa died, which had been 2 years ago in August. 2 years, 3 months, and some days that he had stopped counting, because counting days since a person died was a way of turning grief into arithmetic, and grief was not arithmetic. Nessa had been 26. She had an illness that had been diagnosed too late and treated too late and had moved through her body with an efficiency that the doctors had described with careful neutral language that Rowan had translated in his own mind as fast. It had been fast. That was the one thing. It had been fast enough that some of the pain that a longer dying would have required had been compressed into a shorter window, and he understood he was supposed to find something in that, and sometimes he did. She had been, as a child, a specific kind of person that Rowan had not known how to categorize. She was not easy or difficult in the ways those words usually applied to children. She was thorough. She had a thoroughness about her that expressed itself differently at different ages, but remained consistent in its character. At 6, she had insisted on understanding how the well pump worked before she would agree to drink the water it produced. At 10, she had spent an entire summer learning the names of every grass species that grew in the back field, using a field guide she had found in a box of old books in the barn. And she had kept a list, and the list was still in the drawer of her childhood desk. At 17, she had decided she was going to learn to tune the truck engine herself, and she had learned it imperfectly but earnestly. And Rowan had let her, because the learning mattered more than the result. She had inherited his relationship to the land and to quiet work, and he had watched that inheritance express itself in her with the particular mix of pride and recognition that parents feel when they see themselves in their children in the ways that actually matter. She had also inherited his difficulty with saying the important things out loud. They were 2 people who loved each other completely and said a fraction of it. He had told himself over the years that this was fine, that actions were louder, that showing up every day with the quiet consistency of a person who was not going anywhere, said what words would have only approximated. He had believed this. He still believed it, mostly. But he had also sat by his daughter's bed in those last weeks and understood that there were things that actions could not say, and that the unspoken things had been accumulating for years in a space between them that had been invisible while it was filling up. She had lived on the property with him for the last 8 months of her life, in the room she had grown up in, with the same curtains she had chosen when she was 11 years old. She had refused to change them. He had asked once if she wanted something different, something more grown-up, and she had laughed at him in the particular way she had that made him feel simultaneously foolish and happy. And she had said that those curtains were staying until one of them died. And so they had stayed, and after she died he had not been able to take them down, and they were still there now. Cinder had been her horse first. That was the thing about it. Rowan had bought the Marais as a 3-year-old, which was young for a working horse, with the intention of training her up properly over the following years. She was a bay with a black mane and tail and a single white mark on her left foreleg, low down near the ankle, shaped like nothing in particular, but catching the eye whenever she moved. The man he had bought her from had called her good-tempered and honest, which were the words horsemen used when they meant a horse that did not have hidden problems. That would tell you exactly what it was thinking through its body before it ever acted on the thinking. Rowan had tested this and found it accurate. He had named her Cinder because of the way she looked in the early mornings, when the light was still low and gray, and she was standing at the gate waiting for her feed, her coat the color of coals that have gone cold, but still hold a residual quality of heat deep inside them. Nessa had been 15 at the time. She had walked into the paddock on the first day and put her hand flat against the horse's nose, and something had passed between them that Rowan had watched and not been able to name. Not wildness, exactly. Not docility either. Something more like recognition. The horse had stood very still under Nessa's hand, with her eyes half closed in the way horses close their eyes when something is happening that they want to receive fully, and Nessa had stood there with her hand flat and her face still and looked like someone finding a thing they had been looking for without knowing they were looking. From that point forward, Cinder had been Nessa's horse in every way that mattered. Nessa was the one who fed her in the mornings. Nessa was the one who brushed her out before school and rode her in the evenings and sat with her during the 2 bad bouts of colic that the Marais had suffered in her younger years, sitting on an overturned bucket in the stall for hours, not doing much except being there, which was what you did during colic when the vet had been and the medication had been given, and all that remained was the waiting. Rowan had worked with Cinder too, ridden her when Nessa was away, handled her with the quiet competence of a man who had been around horses all his life. But there was a difference in how Cinder stood when Nessa came through the gate compared to how she stood for anyone else. A difference in the quality of the horse's attention, the way her ears tracked, the particular quality of stillness she held when Nessa was nearby. Rowan had noticed this for years before he ever had a reason to think about what it might mean. When Nessa went to college, Cinder went through a period of several weeks where she stood at the gate of the paddock every evening at the time. Nessa had always come out to ride. Rowan had watched this and said nothing about it to anyone. He had simply come out each evening himself at that time and stood at the gate with her, not filling Nessa's place, but just being present alongside the absence. The horse had adjusted eventually. Horses adjust. They have a practical relationship with loss that human beings find simultaneously admirable and incomprehensible. After Nessa died, Cinder had stopped eating for 4 days. The vet had come and examined her and found nothing physically wrong and said the words behavioral response, which Rowan had accepted without comment. He had stood in the stall with the Marais for those 4 days, not doing much, just being present the way you are present with a creature that is in pain and cannot tell you where it hurts. She had started eating again on the 5th day. She had been, in the 2 years since, steady and manageable and normal in every observable way, until the past week, until the nights by the grave. The first night, he had not understood what he was seeing. He had woken at 2 in the morning with the low-level alertness of a person who has spent decades on a working farm and whose sleep never goes entirely deep, who is always partially listening for the sounds that mean something is wrong. He had not heard a specific sound. He had heard an absence. The absence of the normal sounds that Cinder made at night, the shifting, the occasional stamp of a hoof, the small movements of an animal settling and resettling in a stall. He had gone to the window, on his crutches, in the dark, and looked out. The paddock was empty. He had stood at the window for a moment working through the possibilities. The gate had not been latching properly for the past few weeks, a problem he had been planning to fix and had not yet fixed. He had checked it before dark. He had checked it improperly, as it turned out, with the kind of brief verification that a tired man on crutches performs when the thing he is checking is at the end of a walk he has made 4 times already that day. He scanned the yard. He looked toward the backfield, and then he saw her. She was at the far corner of the property, just inside the stone wall of the old cemetery, standing the way horses stand when they are completely at rest, head low, weight settled, motionless. Except she was not in her stall. She was outside, in the cold, standing over a specific patch of earth in the dark. He had told himself it was a horse doing what horses sometimes do, which was find a particular place on the land that meant something to them for reasons that were not always apparent to the humans watching. He had told himself she had gotten out through the gate and wandered and found a comfortable spot. He had told himself this with the particular conviction of a man who prefers manageable explanations to unmanageable ones and who has become very skilled at the former. He had not quite believed it, even as he was telling it to himself. But it was late, and his foot was hurting, and there was nothing he could do from the window. And so he had watched her for a while longer, and then gone back to bed. The second night she was there again. He stood at the window for 40 minutes, watching. She did not move. Her head was lowered in the way it had been the first night, not grazing, not looking at anything in particular that he could identify from that distance, just lowered, as if she was attending to something directly beneath her. The night was clear and cold, and the stars were very bright, and she stood in the middle of all of it without moving, without acknowledging the cold or the dark or the hour. The third night he did not even check the paddock first. He went straight to the window, as she was already there. 4th, 5th. By the 5th night, a question had formed in him that he could no longer move around, which was whether Cinder was standing over Nessa's grave, specifically, or whether she was simply somewhere in the general area of the cemetery. He could not go out to verify, not easily, not in the dark on crutches over uneven ground. But from the window, from the particular angle of the bedroom window, from where the stone wall ran, and where the older graves were, and where the newer headstones stood at the far corner, it looked, each night, like she was in exactly the same position. The same exact position, the same exact spot. By the 6th night, Rowan had stopped telling himself alternative explanations. By the 6th night, the alternative explanations had worn through. Rowan had not been to Nessa's grave since the end of September. This was a thing he could not explain well, and had stopped trying to explain. He visited in the beginning, daily, then every few days, then weekly, and then something had shifted in him around the 14-month mark that he had not fully understood at the time, and still did not fully understand. He had stopped going, not because the grief had lessened, not because he had reached some plateau of acceptance that the books about loss described with their careful diagrams and numbered stages. He had stopped going because he had come to believe, in the quiet, unreasoning way that a person comes to believe something they cannot prove. But Nessa was not in that ground. She was not there. She was somewhere else, or everywhere else, and going to stand over that particular patch of soil was not the same as talking to her. And talking to her was something he still did, regularly, while feeding the chickens, or walking the fence line, or sitting at the kitchen table in the early mornings with his coffee going cold. He talked to her like she was in the next room. He understood that this was not rational. He did not care. The grave was still tended. Patrice had helped him put in a proper headstone the previous spring, a good piece of gray granite with Nessa's name and dates, and a single line underneath that Rowan had chosen after 3 weeks of trying to find the right words. He had ended up using a phrase Nessa herself had said once, something small and unremarkable she had said at the kitchen table on a winter evening when she was in one of her quiet moods. She had said, "There are more ways to stay than we know." He had not thought about it much at the time. He thought about it now. The cemetery, such as it was, occupied a 1/4 acre in the back corner of the property, enclosed by the low stone wall that an earlier owner had built sometime in the late 1800s. There were 9 other graves there, all from that earlier time, their headstones worn to near illegibility, their names half gone. Rowan had kept the wall maintained and the grass cut, but he had never felt any particular connection to those old stones. He had put Nessa there because she had asked him to. She had asked him specifically, clearly, without sentimentality, the way she approached most things that mattered to her. She said she wanted to be on the property. She said she did not want to be somewhere he had to drive to. She had made it as easy as she possibly could. On the 4th night of Cinder's vigil, Rowan had called Patrice. It was late, past 10, and he knew she would be up because Patrice was one of those people whose body had apparently never learned the normal human relationship to darkness and sleep. She answered on the 2nd ring. He told her what the horse had been doing. There was a silence on Patrice's end that was not quite surprise, but something adjacent to it. She came over the next morning. They stood at the fence together, Rowan on his crutches, Patrice with her coffee, watching Cinder in the far paddock. The horse looked normal in the daylight. She was grazing, moving slowly along the fence, her dark coat catching the thin October sun. Nothing about her suggested the animal who had been standing motionless in the dark for 4 consecutive nights. Patrice asked if the horse was eating. Rowan said he was not sure, now that she mentioned it, and they went to check the feed room, and the feed room told them she was not eating. The bucket was full. The hay rack was untouched. Patrice looked at him. He said he would call the vet. The vet came that afternoon, a young man named Stellan Vorse, who had taken over the practice from the older vet who had retired the year before. He was thorough and careful, and found nothing physically wrong with the Mare. He said, as the previous vet had said 2 years earlier in a different context, that the behavior might be a response to some kind of stress, environmental or emotional. He said horses were more sensitive to changes in their environment than most people realized. He asked if anything had changed recently. Rowan said no. The vet nodded and said to let him know if the eating didn't improve in the next few days. After Stellan left, Patrice said quietly, looking out at the back field, that maybe it was worth going out there. Rowan said where. Patrice said to the grave. He did not answer her right away. She did not push it. They stood there a while, and then she said she needed to get back, and she left, and he stood at the kitchen window, looking at the far corner of the property until the light started to fail. That night, for the first time, he went to the window and watched Cinder walk to the cemetery. It was not a gradual thing. She did not wander or circle. She walked directly from the paddock gate, which Rowan had noticed had been coming open on its own for the past week, toward the low stone wall, and she stepped over it with the unhurried deliberateness of an animal that knew exactly where it was going, and she went to the grave, and she stopped. She stayed there until well past midnight, standing perfectly still, her head lowered slightly in a way that was not grazing. He stood at the window watching her until his eyes hurt and his good leg ached from standing. He lowered himself back to the bed and lay there in the dark, and he thought about Nessa. He thought about the last thing she had said to him. She had said, "I need to tell you something." She had said it clearly, not in the drifting way she sometimes spoke in those last weeks. He had been sitting beside the bed, and he had leaned forward and said, "I'm listening." And she had looked at him for a long moment with her eyes very still, and then her eyes had closed, and by the time they opened again, she was somewhere else in the conversation, talking about the curtains, asking if the chickens were getting enough feed, and the moment was gone. He had told himself in the days and weeks afterward that whatever she had meant to tell him had probably not been important. He had told himself this in the same way that a person tells themselves a necessary untruth, because the truth is too heavy to carry alongside everything else. He had never quite believed it. On the 6th day, Patrice came back. She brought her neighbor's dog, a mixed breed named Burl, who was friendly and low-key, and whose sole purpose in the visit was to walk with them in the yard, while Patrice helped Rowan with some of the outdoor tasks he had been unable to do since the injury. It was a practical arrangement and a kind one. Burl was the one who changed things. The dog had been roaming freely, as dogs do, sniffing along fence lines and investigating corners, while Rowan and Patrice worked near the barn. At some point, Burl pushed through the gap in the back fence that Rowan had been meaning to fix and wandered into the back field. And from the back field he wandered toward the cemetery wall. And from the cemetery wall he found a way through and began nosing around among the old headstones. Cinder was in the near paddock at the time. What happened next was something Rowan would describe later as not exactly a charge, and not exactly a warning, but something in between, something with a vocabulary that horses have and humans mostly don't. Cinder moved from the paddock to the back field in a controlled, fast way that covered the ground without breaking into full gallop. She came to the cemetery wall and stopped. She positioned herself between Burl and the far corner of the cemetery, the corner where Nessa's stone stood, and she made a sound that Rowan had heard from her exactly once before, years ago, when a coyote had gotten into the paddock at night. It was not a sound of aggression. It was a sound of boundary. Burl retreated without being touched, because Burl was a dog who had lived long enough to understand the language of that sound. And he came back through the fence gap and returned to the yard, and Cinder stayed where she was, standing at the cemetery wall, not grazing, not moving, her head turned toward Nessa's headstone. Patrice was the one who saw it. She had been watching the whole thing from the fence, and when Cinder had moved into position, Patrice had followed the line of the horse's attention to the headstone, and she had noticed something that Rowan, from where he stood, had not been able to see. Something was sticking out of the ground at the base of the stone. Not the stone itself. Something else. Something dark and square-edged at the corner where the granite met the earth. She said, "Rowan." He said, "I see it." He had not seen it, but he said it, and then he moved on his crutches to the fence and looked where she was looking, and he saw a shape in the soil at the base of the headstone that had not been there when he had last visited, or at least had not been visible, and the October rains had been coming steadily for the past 2 weeks, and the ground had that soft-moved quality of soil that has been washed and shifted. Something was there. He said he needed to go out there. Patrice said she would go. He said it had to be him. There is a particular quality to October mornings on high ground in the northern part of this country, when the mist comes in low across the fields, and the light has not yet decided what it is going to be, and the world feels like a place that has not finished being made. Rowan had always found that quality comforting. He had grown up on this land, 70 acres that his grandfather had cleared and his father had farmed, and that he had managed in his own way. which was less about farming and more about keeping things alive and in good order and not letting the land lose its character. He had grown up understanding, in the way you understand things you have never been taught, that land has a character, that the particular configuration of soil and slope and water and history that makes one piece of ground different from the next is not neutral, is not merely geography. His grandfather had known this. His father had known it. He had been passed the knowledge not in words, but in example, in the way his father walked the property each morning and what he stopped at and for how long, in the way certain areas were never disturbed, even when disturbing them might have been practical, in the way that the stone wall around the old cemetery had been maintained by every owner of this land for as long as anyone could trace, not out of legal obligation, but out of a kind of respect that nobody felt the need to articulate because it was simply assumed. He had raised Nessa on this land. He had taught her to drive on this land poorly in his truck on the lower field, the two of them laughing until the truck stalled on the small rise near the eastern fence. He had watched her leave for college from the driveway of this property and had stood in that driveway for a long time after her car was gone, watching the dust settle on the dirt road, not because he was sad exactly, though he was, but because he was marking the moment the way he marked all significant things, with attention and stillness and the willingness to simply stand with what was true without needing to change it. He had watched her come back years later in different circumstances and had tried to make the coming back feel like what it was, which was not defeat, but was not what either of them had planned either. She had come back in March, still winter, the field still brown and the trees still bare, and she had stood in the kitchen on the first morning with her hands around a mug of coffee and looked out at the property through the kitchen window, and he had watched her face go through something he could not name, some private reckoning, and then she had said it smells the same. He had not known what to say to that. He had said yes, he supposed it did, and she had nodded, and they had stood together in the kitchen in the morning light and not said anything for a while, and it had been, in some way he could not have explained at the time, all right. She had come back because she wanted to be here. She had said that clearly. She had said, "I want to be somewhere I know." He had understood what she meant. This land was somewhere she knew. Getting to the cemetery on crutches was not a small undertaking. He had known it would not be. He had thought about it for 2 days, from the moment Patrice had spotted the object at the base of the headstone, and in those 2 days he had constructed and dismissed several plans for getting to the cemetery that did not involve him going himself. He had considered asking Patrice to retrieve whatever was there. He had discarded this before the thought was fully formed. He had considered waiting until his foot was stronger, until he could walk the distance properly. He had discarded this too, because waiting was no longer something he was capable of. Not after 7 nights and an object in the ground, in 2 years of not knowing what Nessa had been trying to say. He had slept poorly for 2 nights running. He had lain in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about the shape of that tin against the soil. He had thought about Nessa's hands placing it there, which was a thought he could not stop returning to. Her hands in that soil. Some evening or morning when he had been somewhere else on the property, somewhere ordinary, doing some ordinary task, and she had been in that cemetery with a tin and a letter and the intention of leaving something for him that she could not give him directly. He had thought about that for 2 days, and he had not slept well, and this morning he had gotten up and put on his heaviest jacket and retrieved the crutches and told himself, with the flat finality that he reserved for decisions that were already made, that he was going. The path from the barn to the back field involved 2 gates, one of which had a latch that required 2 hands, which meant leaning the crutches against the fence post and working the latch with both hands, and then retrieving the crutches and getting through before the gate swung back. The ground in the backfield was uneven, tufted with winter-brown grass and pocked with the depressions and rises that all old farm fields accumulate over decades of use and weather and time. The kind of ground that looks passable until you are on it with crutches, and your weight is on your arms instead of your feet, and every small rise requires a recalculation. He fell once, halfway across the field. Not badly. He went down on one knee, caught himself with both crutches, held himself there for a moment while the pain in his foot announced itself. He stayed down for a minute, not because he could not continue, but because something in him needed a moment. The field was very quiet. The frost had not yet come, but the cold was in the air in the way that precedes frost, a particular quality of stillness and compression. A crow called somewhere past the stone wall. He could hear his own breathing. He got up. He kept going. It took him 11 minutes to cover what would normally have been a 2-minute walk. He knew this because he had been counting, in the involuntary way that the mind counts things when it is trying to stay occupied during something that is physically or emotionally difficult. 11 minutes of uneven ground and cold air, and the sound of the crutches on the frost-hardened grass. Patrice had offered to come with him. He had thanked her and said no, not unkindly, in the way that she accepted without argument, because she understood him well enough to know that whatever was in that cemetery, he needed to arrive there alone. She was back at the house, and he could feel her watching from the kitchen window without looking, the particular way of someone who is trying to give a person privacy while also not being able to fully look away. He did not look up much on the way across the field. He watched the ground. He watched where he placed the crutches. He was aware, peripherally, of Cinder. She had come out of the paddock when she saw him moving across the yard, and now she was following along the inside of the fence line at the same pace he was moving, which was a thing she had done sometimes when Nessa walked slowly, as if she wanted to be parallel to her without being in her way. Rowan had not seen her do it in 2 years. He was aware of it in the way that you are aware of something that costs you more than you expected, that lands somewhere deep without announcement. He reached the stone wall and got over it, which was an awkward and undignified process that involved sitting on the top of it and swinging both legs over and then lowering himself down the other side with the crutches angled against the wall for support, the wall being old enough and uneven enough that finding the right purchase took 2 attempts. He had been an athletic man in his youth. He was 63 now, with a broken foot and 2 weeks of limited movement behind him, and he was not in his youth. He made it. He stood inside the wall, and he oriented himself among the old graves, and he moved toward the back corner, toward the gray granite stone with Nessa's name on it. Cinder had come to the outside of the wall and was standing there, watching him. He did not look at her yet. He moved to the stone, and he stopped, and he stood for a moment looking at her name and the dates and the line he had chosen. There are more ways to stay than we know. He had stood in front of this stone before, many times in the first year, and he had always felt the same thing standing in front of it, which was the slightly vertiginous quality of having a person's whole life compressed to granite and numbers, reduced to a span with a dash between the years, and knowing that everything that mattered had happened inside that dash, and the dash could not hold any of it. The grass around the base of the stone was pressed down from rain. The earth was soft and dark, the way earth gets in October after a wet week, when the topsoil has taken on enough water that its surface becomes slightly fluid again, slightly willing to move. And there, at the bottom corner of the stone where the granite pressed against the ground, the soil had shifted away in a way that was clearly recent, washed by rain or disturbed by something, and what had emerged was the corner of a tin box. It was a small tin, the kind that had once held cookies or tea or something else that came in tins, dark with soil, its lid partially visible. It had not been here by accident. It had not worked its way to the surface naturally. Something, or the rain, or both, had shifted it upward from whatever shallow depth it had been placed at, and Cinder had been standing over it for 7 nights, and now he was here. He lowered himself to the ground, which was harder than it should have been with his foot in its cast, and his hands needing to manage the crutches. He sat beside the stone with his back against the cold granite, and he used his hands to loosen the soil around the tin, working it free carefully, the way you work something free that you are not yet ready to see. The tin came loose. He held it. It was heavier than its size suggested, or maybe it was not heavier, and he was only feeling what he expected to feel. It was sealed. The lid was tight in the way of old tins that have been closed and left to the pressure of time. He worked the lid with his thumbs, and it came open with a sound that was too small for what it was. A small mechanical click, and inside was a cloth wrapped around something, folded, dry despite everything, and under the cloth was an envelope. The envelope had his name on it. His name in her handwriting, not a formal name, not a printed label. Her handwriting, the handwriting he knew as well as his own. The particular way she made the capital R with that extra loop that she had never been able to train herself out of, that he had found on grocery lists and birthday cards, and notes left on the kitchen table for 26 years. He sat with the envelope in his hands for a long time. He could hear Cinder on the other side of the wall. He could hear her breathing. He thought about what Nessa had said in those last weeks, the things she had said clearly, and the things that had trailed off. And he thought about the particular night she had said, "I need to tell you something," and then had not been able to say it. He thought about 2 years of wondering what it had been. He opened the envelope. It was 12 pages. He did not know later how long it took him to read. The light changed. He did not notice. The cold came into the ground under him and worked its way through his jacket and into his back. He did not notice that either. He read the letter the way you read something that you needed to have read years ago and are only reading now, with the kind of attention that is not attention so much as it is absorption, the kind where the words go directly into whatever part of you receives things you are not ready for and holds them without flinching. She had written it in the months before she died, she said, a little at a time, over the course of a summer that she described as the most honest summer of her life, which she acknowledged was a strange thing to say about the summer you were dying. She said that the honesty had surprised her. She said she had expected the last summer to feel like a diminishment, like everything becoming less, and instead it had felt like a clarification, like the world getting more specific, like the important things announcing themselves clearly, for the first time, while the unimportant things stepped back and stopped making noise. She described waking in the mornings and lying in the bed she had slept in since childhood and listening to the sounds of the property. The chickens. The particular creak of the barn door when Rowan opened it at 6 in the morning, which she had heard every morning of her childhood and had not thought about since she left, and now heard with an attention so complete it felt almost ceremonial. She wrote that she had cried one morning, quietly, into the pillow she had slept on as a girl, not because she was dying, but because of the barn door, because of the specific sound of it, because of what it meant to have grown up somewhere that had a sound like that. She had tried to tell him in person. She had tried many times. The letter was full of the attempts. The night on the porch when she had started to say something and then let the moment go because she could not find the entry point, the place where the thing she needed to say could begin without sounding like something else. The afternoon she had driven with him to the hardware store and sat in the truck while he was inside and turned the words over in her mind until they felt wrong from every angle and put them away again. The last weeks, when she was mostly in the bedroom, when she had said, "I need to tell you something," and then had not been able to find the shape of it because the shape was too large and the time was too small. She had buried the letter because, she explained, she could not bear to hand it to him while she was in front of him, watching him read it. She could not be present for that. The letter needed to reach him after, when he could be alone with it, when he could take as much time as he needed, when there was no one watching his face. She had buried it at the stone because it was the only place she could think of that he would eventually find it. She had been wrong about eventually, but she had trusted that he would come. What she had wanted to tell him was this. She had been angry at him for years, and then she had stopped being angry, and she had never told him either the anger or the stopping, and she needed him to know both. The anger was about her mother, who had left when Nessa was 7, who had left badly, and suddenly in a way that Nessa had spent the rest of her childhood trying to understand, had told Nessa something the last time they had spoken, when Nessa was 19, and the conversation had been the last one they ever had. Her mother had said that the reason she had left, the real reason, the one she had never been able to say while she was living in that house, was not about not loving Nessa, was not even mostly about not loving Rowan, though the love had been complicated and the marriage had been difficult. The real reason, her mother said, was that she had been afraid in a specific way, of a specific thing that she had never been able to name, but that had to do with the property and the graves and the way. Rowan seemed to belong to the land more than he had ever belonged to her. And Nessa, at 19, had heard this and had been furious at her father in the way that you are furious at someone not for what they did, but for what it cost you. She had been furious that the land had mattered more than her mother staying. She had been furious that a piece of ground had been more important than a family intact. And she had carried that fury quietly for years, not directing it at him, not doing anything with it, because she loved him and because she was his daughter and because she understood. On some level she could not articulate that what he had with this land was not a preference or a choice, but something closer to a necessity. Like the way certain birds cannot migrate in a different direction than the one they were born knowing. She had never told him she knew why her mother left. She had never told him she had been angry. She had let it sit in her, quietly, alongside everything else for 7 years, until she came home to die, and the anger did something unexpected. It dissolved, not all at once, not through any particular conversation or event. It dissolved the way things dissolve when you stop protecting them, when you simply let them be what they are and wait. And then she had understood something that the healthy version of her had not been able to understand. She wrote about it with great care. She said that she had watched him all those months of coming home. She had watched him with the land and with the animals and with the early mornings and the late evenings and the fight. Way he moved through the property with a particular quality of attention that she could only describe now as love. The kind of love that does not need to be witnessed to exist. The kind that keeps doing its thing in the dark and the cold and when there is no one watching. The kind that is expressed through the latching of a gate and the checking of the water level in a bucket, and the standing beside a fence in the morning because a horse is standing there too, and you know how to be present with another creature without demanding anything from the being present. She had watched him with Cinder. She wrote about watching him in the paddock one evening, standing with the Marai in the long light of a summer dusk, not doing anything, just standing there with one hand on her neck and his face turned toward the far field. And she had understood something in that moment that she could not have put into words when she was 7 or 19 or 23. She understood that the land and the animals were not the reason her mother had left. They were the thing about him that was most true. They were the part of him that had no artifice in it, no performance, no accommodation to what anyone else thought he should be. And to be angry at him for them was to be angry at him for being exactly himself, and she could not do that anymore. She was not angry anymore. She had not been angry for a long time. What she wanted him to know, more than anything else in those 12 pages, was that she had forgiven whatever needed forgiving, not because she had turned something over in her mind and concluded that she should, but because she had come home and been cared for, and watched him be himself, and it had been enough. More than enough. She wrote that those 8 months, the sick months, the hard months, the months she had expected to feel like a diminishment, and that had turned out to feel instead like a clarification, had been the months of her life when she felt most clearly what she was part of. She had felt it with him. She had felt it with the land. She had felt it with Cinder. She described a morning when she had been well enough to go to the paddock, leaning on the fence in the early light, and Cinder had come to her without being called, had pushed her nose against Nessa's shoulder, in that particular way horses have, and Nessa had stood there with the horse's breath warming the side of her face, and the frost still on the grass, and the light still low, and she had thought, clearly and without sadness, I have been loved well on this earth. She wanted him to know that. She had buried the letter, thinking that some day, when she was ready, she would tell him where it was. She had died before she could do that. She had trusted the land to keep it until the time was right. The last lines of the letter were short. They were the kind of short that comes at the end of 12 pages of truth, when there is almost nothing left to say, and what remains has to be very small to hold everything inside it. She wrote, I know you still talk to me. I know you talk to me while you feed the chickens. I hear you, Pop. I always hear you. And then, below that, in smaller letters, as if she had added it at the very end, perhaps the last time she had opened the tin, perhaps on one of the last days she was able to leave her bed, she had written, Tell Cinder she can rest now. He sat with the letter for a long time. He did not cry immediately. He sat with the granite against his back, and the letter in his hands, and the cold coming up through the ground, and he looked at the sky above the back field, which was doing what October skies do in the late afternoon, going from blue to something deeper that is not quite blue and not quite gray, and exists only for a few minutes each evening before the dark comes in. Then he cried. He cried the way a man cries when he has been holding something for 2 years and 3 months, and some days that he had stopped counting, and the holding is done, and the grief and the relief are so thoroughly mixed together that there is no separating them. And he did not try to separate them. He let it come. Cinder was still at the wall. He could hear her shifting her weight on the cold ground. He could hear her breathing. After a while, he folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope, and put the envelope in the inside pocket of his jacket, against his chest where it stayed warm from his body, heat in the way that letters do when they are close enough to touch. He got to his feet with the help of his crutches and the headstone, which he pressed his palm against for balance, and also for something else, something he did not need to name. He moved to the wall. Cinder raised her head when he got close. She watched him. She was standing in the last of the light, her dark coat absorbing it the way it always did, making her look like something that was made from the dusk rather than just standing in it. He said out loud, in the voice he used when he was talking to her, and not performing talking, the quiet voice he had been using on this property all his life. He said her name, just her name, Cinder. And then he said what the letter had asked him to say. He said, She says you can rest now. The horse stood very still. Then she lowered her head slowly until her nose was against his shoulder, and she breathed out, a long, slow exhalation that he could feel through his jacket, and they stood like that together in the last of the light. He did not know later, and could not have said, how long they stood there. He knew that by the time he started back across the field, the dark had come in fully and the stars were out. He knew that Cinder walked beside him the whole way back, on the other side of the fence, matching his pace on the crutches, step for step, the way she had done years ago when Nessa moved slowly and the horse moved slowly to be with her. He fed her that night. She ate. He sat at the kitchen table after, with the letter in front of him, and he read it again. He read it more slowly the second time. He stopped at the parts that he needed to stop at. He did not try to move through the hard sections quickly. He thought about Nessa's mother. He thought about the land and what it had cost. He thought about all the conversations he had not known to have, the ones that had happened inside other people, while he was moving through his days without knowing they were happening. He sat with all of that, and he did not try to resolve it, because it was not the kind of thing that resolves. He thought about what Nessa had written about those last 8 months. He thought about her at the fence in the early light, with Cinder's nose against her shoulder. He thought about, "I have been loved well on this earth." He said it out loud, alone at the kitchen table. He said it again. Patrice came the next morning, and he told her. He told her about the tin box and the letter, told her enough of it that she understood what it was and what it meant. Not all of it, not the private parts, because some things that pass between a parent and a child are meant to be carried only in the one direction. She sat across the table from him, and her coffee went cold while she listened, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "That horse knew." Rowan said he did not know how to explain that. Patrice said she did not think it needed explaining. She said, "Some things that horses perceive, science has a name for. Some things science is still working on. And some things," she said, looking out the window toward the paddock where Cinder was grazing steadily in the morning light, eating with the focus of an animal making up for lost time, "some things you just let be what they are." Rowan said he thought that was right. He looked out at the horse. The horse lifted her head and looked back in that level way horses do, with that quality of seeing that does not seem like seeing so much as it seems like knowing. He had raised that animal from a foal. He had watched her belong to his daughter, and then outlive his daughter, and then stand vigil over his daughter for 7 nights in the dark until he came. He did not know what to call that. He did not know if there was a word for what she had done, for whatever it was in her that had led her to that patch of ground and kept her there and waited. He was not sure he needed a word. Stellenvorst came back a week later for a routine follow-up on Cinder's eating, which had returned to normal as completely as it had stopped. He examined her thoroughly and found her healthy and settled and in good condition for her age. He asked what had changed. Rowan told him in abbreviated form about the letter. The vet was quiet for a moment. He was young, Stellan, young enough that his professional instincts sometimes competed with the other kind, and Rowan could see him deciding which one to follow. He said, "Horses do form deep attachments." He said the science on equine grief was still being written. He said that there were documented cases of horses returning to the sites where significant companions had been, sometimes years after the fact, in behaviors that were consistent with what could be called mourning. And then he stopped with the scientific register and said, "What she did, coming back to that spot for 7 nights, I don't have a word for that. Not a clinical one." Rowan said he didn't either. The vet left, and Rowan went to the paddock, and Cinder came to him without being called. He stood with her a while. He told her about the chickens, which were having a disagreement about the feed situation. He told her about the gutter, which still needed fixing, which he would be able to get to once his foot healed, which the doctor said would be another 3 weeks at minimum. He told her that Patrice was coming for dinner Friday and was making something she had described as a lamb dish that she was confident about, which he was cautiously optimistic about. He talked to her the way he talked to Nessa, the same voice, the same quiet, steady register, the same assumption, which was not quite rational, and which he had stopped trying to be rational about, that somewhere in the telling there was someone receiving it. He put his hand on her neck. She put her nose against his shoulder. The field was brown and still in the November light. The stone wall at the back was visible from here, and past it, at the far corner, the gray granite headstone, and around the headstone the grass that the recent rains had made green again, the way grass always comes back greener after the hard weather, the way things do. He had the cast off in November. He was walking normally by early December, with only a slight unevenness that the doctor said might or might not resolve fully, depending on how he treated it. He treated it by walking. He walked the property every morning, all 70 acres, the way he had always walked it, in the particular loose circuit that covered the field and the fence line and the barn and the chicken run and the backfield and the cemetery. He stopped at the grave every morning now, not to stand over it in grief, or not only in grief, to talk, the way he talked to her in the kitchen while the coffee was coming, the way he talked to her in the paddock with Cinder listening. He would stand at the stone and say whatever needed saying that day, the small things and the larger ones, and then he would be on his way. He noticed, in those first weeks of going every morning, that the act of going changed something. Not the grief, not the absence, but the particular quality of the absence, which had been, for 2 years, something he moved around rather than through. He had not realized how much energy he had been spending on the moving around until he stopped doing it. He stood at the stone each morning and said what he had to say, and then he walked away, and the walking away was different because he had been present first. He thought about what she had written about the mornings, about lying in her childhood bed listening to the barn door, about waking to the sounds of the property and letting them be what they were without demanding anything from them. He tried this in his own way. He stood at the kitchen window with his coffee some mornings and simply listened, the way she had described listening, with the kind of attention that receives rather than processes. The chickens, Cinder in the paddock, the particular quality of the October wind through the old walnut tree, which had a different sound than any other wind through any other tree on the property, a sound he had heard his entire life without once stopping to hear it. He heard it now. He fixed the gutter in December from a different ladder, with a rope tied around his waist that was attached to the chimney, which Patrice had insisted on, and which he had complied with more than he would normally comply with things, because he was trying lately to take slightly better care of himself. Nessa had asked him to, in the letter, not in those words. But she had asked him in the way she had always asked him things, sideways, embedded in something else, so that he could only hear it fully after he had read everything else first. She had written, near the end, that she did not want to spend her time on the other side, wherever the other side was, worrying about whether he was eating properly or going up on ladders without someone to hold them. She had written she had done enough worrying about him in this life to last 2 lifetimes, and she needed him to make it easier on her. He had laughed when he read that. He had laughed and then stopped laughing and then sat very still for a while. He was trying to make it easier on her. He put on the rope. He fixed the gutter. He ate regular meals and called Patrice on the days she did not come by and told her honestly when things were hard, which he had not done before, which she had been waiting for without saying she was waiting. There was a particular conversation he had with Patrice on a Friday evening in November when she had come for dinner and they had stayed at the table long after the food was finished, that he returned to often in the weeks that followed. She had asked him carefully whether reading the letter had given him what he needed, whether it had been the closing of something. He had thought about this for a long time before answering. He had said that it had not felt like a closing. He had said it felt more like a correction, like a map that had been slightly wrong for years, and someone had finally updated it, and now the territory and the map matched. He had said that the grief was the same, the absence was the same, but the shape of what he was holding had changed, and the changed shape was easier to carry. Patrice had said that was a good way to put it. He had said he was not sure he had put it right. He said that there were things in those 12 pages that he was still reading, in the sense of still understanding, still finding the full meaning of. He said he thought he would probably be reading it for years. She said that sounded about right for 12 pages of the truth. He did not know what he believed about where Nessa was. He had never been a man of straightforward faith. had not been to a church since his own father's funeral, had always found more in a field at dawn than in any sermon. He did not know if the dead could hear. He did not know if whatever had guided Cinder to that stone for 7 nights was the kind of thing that could be explained, or the kind that only asked to be accepted. He knew what he had found in the ground. He knew what was written in the 12 pages he had carried in his inside pocket until he could find the right place to keep them, which turned out to be not in a drawer or a box, but in the breast pocket of the work jacket that hung by the kitchen door. The jacket he put on every morning when he went out. The jacket he had owned for 15 years. The one with the tear in the left elbow that he had never mended and probably never would. The letter was in that pocket every morning when he went out. He let that be what it was. He knew that his daughter had loved him and had forgiven him and had sat at a paddock fence in the early light of her last spring and felt loved and then right about it. He knew that a horse had stood vigil in the dark for 7 nights until he came. He let all of it be what it was. There is still a tin box on the shelf above Rowan's desk, empty now, its lid placed beside it. It is rusted around the edges and darkened with soil that he chose not to clean off entirely. He does not know exactly why he kept it. He has never tried to explain it. On the shelf beside the tin is a photograph that Patrice found in Nessa's room when they were sorting through her things. A photograph that had been on Nessa's bedside table the whole time, and that Rowan had somehow not been able to look at directly until several months after she died. It shows the 3 of them, Rowan and Nessa and Cinder, in the near paddock on a summer morning, the light doing what summer light does, making everything look like the best version of itself. Nessa is laughing at something out of frame. Rowan is watching her laugh. Cinder is standing between them with her head turned toward the camera, in that way horses sometimes look at cameras, with a directness that is almost impossible to rationalize away. He does not go a day without looking at it. Some mornings he takes the photograph to the paddock with him. He leans it against the fence post while he does the morning feed, not for any reason he could articulate, just because it seems like the right place for it. Cinder always comes to the fence while he's there. She always lowers her head to his shoulder. She stood for 7 nights in the dark, in the cold, over a patch of earth that held a letter he needed to read. She stood there, and she waited for him to come. He does not know what to call that. He knows it was not nothing.